Hello. So let's continue with the history of cannabis. We'll go from the 1950s until the present. So in the 50s, we started to get worse and worse, more punitive drug laws, and Congressman Hale Boggs wanted to tackle the growing heroin problem and proposed really harsh laws. Now, Anslinger wanted to get marijuana included with heroin because that's kind of where his power came from. That's his history. He was the anti-marijuana crusader. And he kind of made up the gateway drug phenomenon. He made false claims about it. He said, people turn to heroin when the thrill of marijuana is gone. There was no research to back it up. In fact, the research suggested that cannabis is definitely not a gateway drug. But anyway, during the 50s, drug laws really got worse and more intense. There were increased penalties. We had mandatory minimum penalties, and repeat drug offenders were denied parole. We don't see that with rapists, murderers, child molesters, but we do see it for drug offenders and cannabis offenders. So that's getting worse in the 50s. But we started to see a cultural shift in the 50s and the 60s. So the 50s are when the beatniks really started to get culturally significant. And there's a story how beatniks led to Bob Dylan, led to the Beatles. And I'm sure it wasn't quite as direct as that. I'm sure that there are obviously a lot of influences. But Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg, poets and authors, they hung out at the jazz clubs with the African Americans where there was a lot of cannabis, and they tried marijuana. And Allen Ginsberg said, "It was the first time I ever had solid evidence in my own body that there was a difference between reality as I saw it myself and reality as it was described officially by the state, the government, the police, and the media. To a few of us, that experience of marijuana catalyzed a re-examination of all social ideas. Because if one law was full of shit and error, then what of all those other laws?" So it wasn't the drug itself, it wasn't cannabis that led Ginsberg to question authority, but it was the discrepancy between the official claim and the experienced fact. He didn't bash his mother to death with a frying pan, but he saw that they're lying to us. And that fact that people were trying this and saw that the government was lying, really, that started a cultural shift. Now, the story goes that Ginsberg met Bob Dylan at a party, and they hung out and they wrote songs and they wrote poetry and they smoked cannabis together. And then Dylan met the Beatles at a party in 1963. And the story was that the Beatles had never yet tried cannabis, but then they did. And I just want to play your songs from 1964.
Oh yeah, tell you something I think you'll understand when I say that something. I wanna hold your hand. I wanna hold your hand. I wanna hold your hand. Oh.
All right, I'll stop it there. There are all sorts of goofy, adorable. People were offended by their haircuts, but they're wearing suits, for God's sake. All right, so they're singing about this 1964. They're singing about "I Want to Hold Your Hand." Let's hear one from 1967. Well, apparently I can't. Copyright violation. So I had to cut that. But look up Strawberry Fields Forever to get an idea of what they did instead in 1967. By no means suggesting that cannabis was entirely responsible for their change. It was the 60s. There was a lot of cultural change going on. But I just found it interesting, their pre-marijuana songs and the post-marijuana songs and all the changes going on. So throughout the 60s, things were changing. There was a lot of cultural shifts in the 60s, and the laws started to lessen. In 62, Anslinger retired at age 70, and JFK commissioned a committee to study America's drug problem in general. and the White House Conference on Narcotics and Drug Abuse, they concluded that the hazards of cannabis were exaggerated. So we're going into a new change here, and attitudes became more lenient, and more people tried it and found that it didn't lead to insanity and moral decay and homicide, and you're not bashing your mother to death with a frying pan, and Frankenstein isn't dropping dead of fright, and all of those things. And I think also now it was middle-class white people were using it. And so I think that played a role in, oh, well, people like me, making air quotes, are using it. So the perception changed. And in 1969, Timothy Leary, fascinating man, Timothy Leary, who really promoted LSD, and that's a whole different class you could take with me, but promoted LSD, went to the Supreme Court. And the Marijuana Tax Act from 1937 was declared unconstitutional because basically Leary argued that it violated his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. If he was going to abide by this Marijuana Tax Act, he'd have to register to obtain a tax stamp, thereby announcing his intention to commit a crime. So that was abolished in 69. Nixon was not happy. Nixon hated college students. He hated the young. They did not support him. They did not support the Vietnam War. And the government sort of used LSD also, but LSD and marijuana as a stand-in. You couldn't arrest the hippies or the protesters for protesting, but you could arrest them for smoking pot. So what Nixon did is established something called the Controlled Substances Act. This scheduled the drugs. This was in 1970. We're still living on this today. It was very significant. This was the first law to control drugs directly rather than through taxes. Up until 1970, technically, drugs weren't illegal. You could still get arrested for them, but you were violating tax laws. But what Nixon did, he scrapped all the previous laws, which wasn't necessarily a bad thing. They were a mess. They were all a mishmash of all contradictory different laws. So he basically repealed them all and replaced them and consolidated with the Controlled Substances Act. They were all scheduled, and there were 5 schedules. And there's schedules based on the drug's potential for abuse, its medical benefits, if any, and its likelihood for producing dependence. And Schedule 1 was considered the worst, the most dangerous. A Schedule 1 drug has a high potential for abuse. It has no currently accepted medical use and lack of accepted treatment under any circumstances. It's considered a very dangerous drug. And he stuck marijuana as a Schedule 1 drug. Incidentally, I'll say that cocaine is Schedule 2. It does have a recognized medical use. Methamphetamine, Schedule 2. But LSD, psilocybin, which are psychedelic mushrooms, and cannabis, among others, were Schedule 1. Now, he wanted to justify his decision. He basically said, okay, I'm just going to put marijuana there as a placeholder, and then we'll analyze it and see where it really belongs. And so he commissioned the Schaefer Commission to study marijuana. And he said it was a bipartisan commission, but he handpicked most of the members. And he handpicked conservative, pro-law and order, anti-drug, pro-criminal justice system, and pro-war on drugs. He handpicked the commission to be a really strict anti-drug commission. And his quote to the committee, he gave them their charge. And this is a quote, "I want a goddamn strong statement about marijuana, one that just tears the ass out of them." All right, they knew what they had to do. And Schaefer was actually hoping to get a federal judgeship and sort of was promised this if he did what was told, but not outright. So what this committee did is they oversaw a whole bunch of research, 50 research projects, original research projects. There were 73 staff members working full-time, part-time. They got data from scientists and doctors and police and public officials and citizens, and the full report had almost 1,200 pages, published in 1972. And this law and order anti-drug commission, who talked to scientists, who talked to all sorts of people, found that marijuana did not, there was no evidence that it caused physical or psychological harm, no harsh withdrawal, no birth defects, no brain damage, wasn't a gateway. no death from overdose. No, and it's not a cannabis overdose. And they said that the potential harm of getting arrested was much greater than any harm that could come from using the plant. And the Schaefer Commission recommended that the laws be changed, basically to decriminalize it and allow for possession for personal use. Nixon was not happy. Nixon completely rejected the policy before he even finished reading it. And he kind of blamed the report on the Jews. There were too many Jews on the committee. And this is a quote. He said, "You know, it's a funny thing. Every one of the bastards who are out for legalizing marijuana is Jewish. What the Christ is the matter with the Jews, Bob? What is the matter with them?" This was on tape. So he didn't get the report he wanted. But there was still, the evidence was coming and coming, and the tide continued to change through the 1970s, really a move towards decriminalization. In 72, NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, launched its first petition to reschedule marijuana to at least to Schedule II. It took something like 24 years till they were finally heard, and it was rejected. 73, Oregon was the first state to decriminalize cannabis. So possession of under an ounce was just a civil offense. And then California followed suit in 75. By 78, 11 states had decriminalized small amounts. Big change we're seeing. President Carter said penalties against drug use should not be more damaging to the individual than the use of the drug itself. So by the late 70s, the DEA considered totally decriminalizing cannabis. What a change we saw. And then here we are, Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, and everything made, woo, did it make when he made a strong shift.
Leading medical researchers are coming to the conclusion that marijuana, pot, grass, whatever you want to call it, is probably the most dangerous drug in the United States, and we haven't begun to find out all of the ill effects, but they are permanent ill effects. Leading medical researchers are...
So it's reefer madness all over again. That same statement, it's the most dangerous, the most violence-causing drug in the history of mankind. Nancy Reagan got in on this. Nancy Reagan was not very popular and needed a cause that people could get behind, that people would support her. She figured anti-drug was the way to go.
Say yes to your life. And when it comes to drugs and alcohol, just say no. Say yes to your life.
Sorry about that. So, just say no. Classic. Reagan's also said there is no moral middle ground. If you're a casual user of marijuana, you're an accomplice to murder. They encouraged children to turn their parents in for drug use, and this happened. There was one 13-year-old girl in California who said, "My parents are smoking cannabis," and her parents ended up serving 3 years in prison, and she was put into foster care. So it really turned the tide against cannabis, against all drugs. Throughout the 80s, all right, Reagan threw the full weight of the government behind the anti-drug movement. He waived what's called the Posse Comitatus Act, which was an 1878 law prohibiting the military from enforcing state laws, and he abolished that. That allowed actual soldiers to fight the war on drugs. In 5 years, the Pentagon's anti-drug spending went from $1 million to $196 million. He established mandatory drug tests for all federal employees, and federal funding moved away from treatment, which is what Nixon really established, to have more treatment and more towards punishment under Reagan. Let's see, there was new laws allowing confiscation of any assets of anyone even suspected of a drug crime. This is civil forfeiture laws. They're still in effect. So they can seize your house, your car, your boat, any money on you if they even suspect you of committing a marijuana crime, a drug crime, and it's very hard to get it back. Between 1982 and 1991, $2.5 billion with a B dollars in assets were seized, and it really funds the police. And so the police have a strong incentive to accuse somebody, just accuse them of a drug crime, because then they could take your stuff. So laws got worse and worse and worse and worse throughout the 80s. And I do believe as a result, this is one of the reasons cocaine got bigger. Like, if you're going to risk prison, if you're going to risk all these laws, and the laws are as bad for marijuana as they are for cocaine, you might as well deal cocaine. I'm not encouraging you to deal cocaine, please know that. But cocaine is much smaller, it doesn't smell as strong, it packs more tightly, it's easier to transport, and it's much higher markup. So if you're gonna, it's the same risk. I think that's one of the reasons cocaine got so big in the 80s. Now, another thing that Reagan did, he appointed the drug czar, and we actually do call him the drug czar, Carlton Turner. He did not like marijuana. And so he said people that use marijuana are anti-military, anti-nuclear power, anti-big business, anti-authority, and he thought that smoking pot would turn young men into homosexuals. Yeah, okay. I don't even have to say anything about that. Now, there was some research. We had the big Schaefer commission that was in 72 and 82. The National Academy of Sciences published their report based on 6 years of research. And there was no convincing evidence that marijuana damaged the brain or the nervous system, and their conclusion was that cannabis should be decriminalized. And Reagan rejected the findings. All right, through the late 80s and 90s, George H.W. Bush, George Sr., he escalated the war on drugs, and his drug czar, William Bennett, called for a massive wave of arrests and urged the prosecutors to go over just weekend pot smokers, not the dealers, not the heavy users, not the suppliers, but mom who's, smoked a little weed on Saturday night. Clinton. Things got much worse under I did not inhale Bill Clinton. He really escalated the war on drugs. The number of jail sentences nationwide for marijuana offenders during Clinton's 2 terms was 800% higher than during the 12 years under Reagan and Bush Sr. And Clinton signed legislation that cut off federal aid to student cannabis offenders and other drug violators. So you don't see that with other offenses, but you should be aware of that. Still is in effect. You can lose your student aid, your funding. You can lose a whole bunch of things we'll talk about later. And U.S. has a higher proportion of its citizens in prison than any other country. We've been number 1 for a long time. We are 4.4% of the world population and 25% of the prison population. All right. 96. Another National Academy of Sciences, 10 years later, report, comprehensive. This was the most rigorous review of cannabis to date. It was years, many scientists, a lot of original research. They looked at what was out there. It was released in 99. And surprisingly, surprisingly, I was kidding, that the potential therapeutic value was there, that it helps with pain, it helps control nausea and vomiting, helps with appetite stimulation, has a lot of medical benefits. And the drug czar under Clinton suppressed it, of course. And he actually made it against the Department of Health and Human Services policy to conduct any research that could lead to the development of cannabis as a licensed drug. So if you put in a grant saying, I want to study cannabis to see if it helps with pain, to see if it helps suppress cancer or nausea and vomiting, you would not get that grant. You had to write it that I want to see how bad cannabis is and look for all the harms. That was an official policy for funding research. All right, but the tide is going to turn back. In 96, this is significant, California approved Proposition 215, and they became the first state to legalize medical use of marijuana. And I want to say that, yes, you can't get a prescription. You still can't get a prescription today because it's still federally illegal. You can get a recommendation from your physician, but even though the state said, yes, in our state, you can use cannabis, it was still federally illegal, and that overrides it. So there were still a whole bunch of arrests. Doctors got arrested and patients. So there was a discrepancy between federal law and state law. Okay, so that was first in 96, 98. Alaska, Oregon, and Washington followed. 2003, the government filed a patent for the therapeutic use of cannabinoids. They said it was useful as a neuroprotectant and an antioxidant. So in the very next year, they refused to consider rescheduling it. So it is Schedule 1, which means they say it has no medical uses. But they took out a patent saying, oh, look, there are medical uses. Huh, all right. That patent ran out last year in 2019. By 2012, 20 states and DC had legalized medical cannabis, and that same year, Colorado and Washington legalized recreational. And we saw the same thing. Even though the state said, yes, adult use is legal, federally it wasn't, and people still got arrested. It's very confusing. 2020. So today, cannabis, medical marijuana is legal in 33 states and DC to some degree or another, and legal adult use in 11 states. Over 27% of Americans live in a state where legal adult use is the rule. So we have to see a tide change. So what I want to just close this with is a little bit about the demographics. I'll start with a roast of weed.
Seriously, weed, if it wasn't for you, I'd never learn how many desserts I could fit into one bowl. The answer is 5 in a burrito. Hey, meth's also here. You know what the cool thing about meth is? That you can make it anywhere, except in a nice neighborhood with good schools. Let's not be too hard on meth. He's the only drug who's aged 5 years since we cut away from him. Oh, Jesus, even I couldn't make that look good. Well, guys, it's been a blast, and I look forward to seeing you all again at Andy Dick's Christmas party. Weed, you pathetic excuse for a drug. Seriously, your users have less balls than steroids. Let's see, who else we got? Oh, Adderall, is that you? Adderall, buddy, I haven't seen you since college. Everybody, Adderall, the only drug that makes you stay up all night so you can't have fun. Yeah. And opium, how the hell did you hear about this? Telegram? And look, Shrooms is here. Kind of. Hey, Ecstasy, give him a poke. Make sure he's still alive. I said poke, not a full body cavity search. Jesus. My God, somebody toss that kid a glow stick or something. But seriously, Weed, I don't know what we'd do without you. Besides move out of our parents' basement. Next up, don't call it a flashback. Straight from the pocket of your uncle's denim jacket, it's LSD.
You know, the funny thing about weed is there's always a giant spider demon standing 3 feet behind him. This next joke is just for the spiders under my skin.
All right, okay, moving on. Next up, he might not be the most popular drug here tonight, but he has the best celebrity endorsements. Give it up for cocaine! Yeah.
Hey, yeah, I'm here. Just had to use the bathroom real quick. Peyote came all the way from Mexico to be here. He said the trip was really uncomfortable because he had a condom full of me stuffed up his ass. Pow! Weed, you make Tim and Eric funny. Frozen pizza tastes good and fish sound like music. Is there anything you can't do besides get a job? Beer, boo, pop! Weed, you may have a TV show, and Meth, you may have a good TV show, but I had a whole decade. She don't lie. She don't lie. Me! It's Eric Clapton.
Hey, what's up, everybody? It's me, Heroin.
When did you get out of jail?
Weed's here. Weed's so great, I bet he'd lend me $500. Meth's here. Meth's so great, I bet he'd lend me $500.
Are you wearing a wire? Everybody freeze! I didn't do anything wrong. Look, everyone here is over 21, except for Whippets, but he had a really good fake.
Shut up. You, Tobacco, and Ambien can leave.
Oh, thank God.
Now, as for the rest of you, you're all going away for a long...
So why do we view certain drugs the way we do? Throughout the semester, we'll talk about the perception, but how do you think people view cannabis today, and has that changed? And certainly in the last 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, how has it changed? Now, if you look at some of these drugs we talked about, I made a chart comparing the use and the percentage of the users that die annually. So a lot of caffeine users, and there are a couple deaths. A lot of alcohol users, and about 88,000 in America die each year. Tobacco, high death rate considering how many people use it. Cannabis, none. 0, 0, 0 deaths. Heroin has a fairly high, very high, not a lot of users, but a high death rate. We'll talk about all this throughout the semester. Now, public opinion. Most Americans support legalization. There are about 3.6 million registered medical marijuana users in the United States as of 2020. And the percentage who approve medical cannabis, the last Gallup poll was 92% of Americans support the use of medical marijuana. 92% of Americans don't agree that the sky is blue. So there's a lot of support for medical, and most Americans support the legalization of adult use for cannabis. The last poll was about 67% support legal adult use. So that's a majority. Now, who is more likely to approve? We tend to see these, and none of these are going to be a surprise. So about 67% overall think cannabis should be approved. Males slightly more than females. Whites more than blacks, more than Hispanics, but it's still all a majority. The younger you are, the more likely you are to support the legalization of adult use. Pretty close with education, and no surprise, Democrats more than Republicans. And I found this graph interesting from the Pew Research Center from the 60s. This is how many believe that cannabis should be made illegal or remain illegal, and how many think it should be legalized. And we'll do that later. So with this poll, I will close it out.